Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Pérez Art Museum Miami online. I am María Elena Ortiz, I'm curator, and I'm also leading the Caribbean Cultural Institute, an initiative dedicated to the understanding and appreciation of Caribbean art. Tonight, we're hosting CCI's Art Talks Live, Myth and Spirituality in Caribbean Art. Before I continue, I want to let you know that this program is actually being interpreted in both English and French, and you can get the adequate interpretation by going to your screen, clicking on interpretation and on the channel that you desire, that being English or French, and you'll be able to listen to the conversation at your language of preference. Also, there you're going to see a box for Q&A, which you'll be able to post your question both in English and French, and we'll address it around 25 to 30 minutes from now when we go into the Q&A section. This program is presented with the generous support of the Mellon Foundation, who provide the fund to start the CCI initiative. I also need to give a special thank you to Memorial Act in Guadalupe, an exceptional institution that made the Artist Fellowship possible, and the Cultural Services of French Embassy for their generous support here in Miami. I would also like to thank our incredible PAMM team that makes this program possible. Thank you to our registration and collection departments for their support with our fellows. Also to our communications and marketing teams that make a great job at promoting this event. And thank you to our amazing AV team made with Denise Faxa and Andrew Bird. I also want to remind you that the open call for the 2021 fellowship is now open. The deadline is April 8th of this year, and you can find more information about that at cci.pam.org. Now, tonight, we will hear from the 2020 CCI Fellows, artist Ronald Cyrille and PhD candidate Julián Sánchez González. After their presentations, we will have a brief conversation with them and Cultural and Caribbean Cultural Institute Coordinator Iberia Pérez and myself. First, Cyrille will briefly share his practice, followed by Sanchez Calderon analysis on three works of our collection from artists Arnaldo Roche-Rabell, Belkis Ayón, and Purvis Young in relation to myth and spirituality. In collaboration with Memorial Act, Centre Caribbean de Expresión et de Memoria de la Traite de Esclavage in Guadeloupe, and excuse me for that, the 2020 CCI Artist Fellowship was awarded to visual artist Ronald Cyrille, also known as Blackbird. During the fellowship, Cyrille had a studio in the premises of Memorial Act where he produced a series of new works. As part of this program, Cyrille had the opportunity to engage in a series of virtual studio visits with international and regional scholars and curators, including Dr. Marsha Pierce, Claire Tancons, Dr. Terry Guys, Giscard Bouchet, and Simone Namji. Recognized for his public artworks and surreal imageries, Cyrille creates paintings, drawings, sculptures, and murals that present his personal mythology. His colorful and energetic brushstrokes reveal otherworldly figures in dreamlike settings, evidencing humor, satire, and Caribbean histories. Inspired by the writings of Edouard Glissant and Aimé Césaire, Cyrille evokes the lusciousness of the Caribbean landscape alongside the region's instability and idiosyncrasies. Cyrille's work has been presented in solo exhibitions at prestigious venues such as the Volta Art Fair, New York, Remy Unsat Cultural Center, Pontypridd, Guadeloupe, the Fondation Clément and Atrium, both in Fort-de-France. Cyrille has participated in group exhibitions at the Hunter East Harlem Galleries, New York, the Little Haiti Cultural Center here in Miami, and Tout Le Monde Festival, among others. He lives and works in Guadeloupe. Now, I will pass the mic to Ronald, who will be giving his presentation in French. So please make sure to click the English interpretation button if you need it. I know I do. And if you value this program and any other programs presented by the museum, please consider supporting us by joining and going to pam.org/donate. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ronald Cyrille.
Bonsoir à tous. Bonsoir à tous. Bonsoir à tous. Bonsoir aux internautes qui nous accompagnent. Et merci à Maria pour cette introduction. Je souhaite remercier le PAMM pour cette opportunité de collaboration ainsi que l'Institut de la culture caribéenne qui m'ont permis, avec cette opportunité, de développer mes recherches et mon travail. Je tiens également à remercier le Memorial Act qui m'a soutenu sur ce projet afin que ce projet soit vraiment une réussite. Merci beaucoup. Donc, pour commencer, je vais parler de mon travail. Donc, dans ma démarche artistique, il s'agit d'une narration. Donc, je peins beaucoup ce qui me mine et ce qui m'anime. Donc, l'histoire qui se passe, un dialogue qui se passe entre mon passé et mon présent. Donc, c'est une mythologie personnelle qui rencontre aussi une mythologie de la Caraïbe, une mythologie des contes et des légendes. Donc, l'idée, c'est que je crée un bestiaire, un univers qui, à partir de mon alphabet de forme, qui par la suite va se retrouver en scène, racontant différentes histoires. Donc, en fait, je peins un peu ce qui me mine, et puis les personnages que je peins évoluent dans des lieux improbables, des lieux qui, par moments, rappellent un peu les souvenirs de mon enfance. Donc, je parle de Green Paradise perdu, les souvenirs les souvenirs du vert paradis perdu. Donc, dans ce premier travail, il s'agit d'une série, il s'agit d'un diptyque. Donc, ce diptyque, c'est un travail sur papier, un papier où j'utilise d'abord des aplats. Donc, moi, ce qui est important de ce travail, c'est que ça me permet justement, ces aplats, d'avoir un travail beaucoup plus épuré, beaucoup plus posé par rapport à mon travail de peinture. Donc là, on retrouve aussi l'idée de bestiaire. Donc, tout à l'heure, là, je parlais de bestiaire et d'alphabet de forme. Donc, ce sont des formes qui s'inspirent à partir du museau du chien créole, où je décide d'en faire tout un univers. Donc là, ce travail d'aplat me permet de donner me permet de mettre en avant la forme par rapport au fond. Donc c'est aussi un travail qui se rapproche un peu du pop art avec de forts contrastes. Moi, ce qui m'intéresse aussi beaucoup dans cette démarche-là par rapport à ma pratique, c'est que finalement, ce sont deux feuilles, j'ai envie de dire unies, que je superimpose, dans lesquelles j'attaque directement à la découpe, au scalpel. Et donc, ça fait qu'il n'y a pas d'erreur. Une fois que tout ce que je fais, je suis obligé de poursuivre, et ce qui fait qu'à la fin, ça crée une forme de dialogue entre le positif, le négatif, le singulier et le pluriel. Et donc, passons à l'image suivante. J'allais changer, mais passons à l'image suivante. Donc, l'image suivante, c'est vraiment une technique qui est différente. Bon, là, il faut que je m'habitue. L'image, donc, c'est vraiment une technique différente. Là, on est dans un travail que je fais en laboratoire en photo. Donc, en fait, ce qui est important à comprendre, c'est que ma posture n'est pas celle du photographe, mais vraiment celui du chercheur. Donc, j'arrive en laboratoire ou chambre noire où j'utilise tous ces produits que je manipule, des manipulations où je veux chercher à abîmer le papier, l'altérer, créer des surprises. Et une fois arrivé au soleil, je me rends compte qu'il y a des formes un peu aléatoires qui se présentent à moi, que je décide par la suite avec l'utilisation de la technique du grattage ou de la bombe ou de l'acrylique, peut-être par moment de préciser, d'effacer, ou encore de jouer avec une forme de transparence. Donc, en fait, c'est dans ces laboratoires, ce sont les lieux où je crée les supports, les lieux où mes personnages vont pouvoir habiter. Si je prends l'exemple, par exemple, ce qui est important pour moi dans ce travail, c'est que beaucoup de choses m'échappent. Si je prends l'exemple de ce personnage qui domine en haut à droite, il est à 70% accidentel. Après, je viens et je précise. On peut passer à l'image suivante. Donc là, on continue. Là, c'est toujours autre chose, volcanique et cannibale. Donc c'est une pièce disons, c'est de la peinture sur toile. Donc là, je mets en scène mon abécédaire. Mon abécédaire, c'est ce vocabulaire plastique qui, comme je disais, qui parle du museau du chien créole. Mais en fait, au début, lorsque je commence, chaque personnage est isolé. Et les grands formats me permettent de créer la relation entre ces personnages. Donc, ce sont des animaux qu'on retrouve, je parle de bestiaires, puisque ce sont des animaux qu'on retrouve aussi dans les contes, dans les légendes et dans les mythologies de la Caraïbe, mais aussi ce sont des animaux qui se retrouvent dans mon quotidien. Et donc, que je décide de mettre en scène, qui deviennent des protagonistes de mes histoires. Donc, par moments, certains animaux peuvent rappeler des postures humaines. Et donc, c'est en ça aussi que ça peut être dérangeant. Donc, on va poursuivre. Next, please. Donc, cette peinture, Sacred Féminine, c'est une peinture où, par exemple, par rapport à tout à l'heure, là, on va voir que là, ici, clairement, la partie céleste et la partie terrestre sont identifiables. Donc là, il s'agit pour moi de retracer un peu mes souvenirs d'enfance. Ces paysages, en fait, ces paysages, la campagne ou la nature sont les lieux souvent qui sont propices à développer les histoires comme les contes, les légendes. Et donc, pour moi, là, il s'agit de la figure mythique de Maman de l'eau. Donc, moi, je décide, à partir de mon bestiaire, de donner ma définition de cette figure. Moi, je vois la maman de l'eau puissante, forte, qui domine le paysage. Et donc, avec tous ces éléments, aussi bien à la fois humain, végétal, la flore, la faune, et donc, avec cette clé qui est aussi, j'ai envie de dire, elle est la gardienne de cette clé qui aussi envoie la vie ou à cette ouverture vers autre part. Je dupe également le personnage avec ce serpent que je place dans l'eau, puisque d'une manière, la culture générale, on s'attend à ce que maman de l'eau se retrouve dans l'eau. On peut poursuivre. Donc là, on est toujours dans cette question de narration. Yékri Yékrak, c'est le nom de cette toile. Donc Yékri Yékrak, généralement, c'est le nom qu'utilise le conteur, celui qui raconte l'histoire. Il l'utilise pour solliciter le regard et l'attention du public. Donc c'est aussi une forme de dialogue. Moi, je décide de recréer ces paysages qui sont des paysages, en fait, c'est un paysage mental, puisque ce paysage même est constitué de fragments de paysages que parfois j'ai rêvé, que j'ai visités, ou qui sont aussi des souvenirs de fragments de paysages lorsque j'allais dans les jardins avec mes grands-parents. Donc, à partir de là, je décide de créer une histoire. Je peins un peu comme un conteur. Je mets tous ces éléments dans le même lieu. Je crée des tensions. Je crée des dialogues. Et puis, ce vert très dominant, c'est aussi, j'ai envie de dire, ce vert qui fait rêver. Donc, c'est Cabri, lorsqu'on regarde ce personnage, je mets ce portrait, la question du portrait, mon visage, c'est aussi pour moi une manière de manifester ma présence dans la scène. Donc, d'amener ma mythologie, d'amener ma mythologie à dialoguer avec les mythologies de mes territoires. Il y a des éléments aussi comme la case créole que j'affectionne, qui là n'est plus seulement juste un habitat, mais qui devient aussi un support, comme je le fais dans mes interventions dans la rue. Donc, on peut poursuivre. Donc là, c'est un travail qui est totalement différent. Là, je suis vraiment dans un travail sur l'imaginaire. L'idée, c'est vraiment de créer des personnages, de me créer une nouvelle famille. Donc, ce sont des portraits d'inconnus, sont des portraits imaginaires. À partir de là, j'utilise le papier peint. Le papier peint, c'est aussi, on me renvoie aussi à une forme de nostalgie, le papier qu'on utilisait pour amener un peu de gaieté dans la maison. Donc, à partir de là, je récupère ce papier en me rendant compte qu'il y a différents papiers et donc différents motifs. Et en les mettant ensemble, ça me crée, il constitue l'univers du personnage qui, par la suite, on a des éléments comme la clé qui deviennent des symboles à force de réutilisation dans mon travail, qui font signe, ou encore on peut voir sur le t-shirt les motifs de B-Bird qui par moment vient polluer le travail comme pour signifier une présence, comme pour créer une forme de suite logique d'histoire. Donc on va poursuivre. Next, please. Donc là, c'est toujours un peu dans la même dynamique, mais là, il ne s'agit pas de papier peint. Là, justement, j'essaie par des procédés de recréer le papier peint. C'est-à-dire que là, avec l'utilisation du pochoir et autres, comment je peux essayer de m'inspirer de ce qui est fait, puisque le papier peint, l'idée, c'est de pouvoir ramener des morceaux disparaître d'éléments que moi, je n'aurais pas créés dans mon travail. Là, je cherche à le créer, sans pour autant mimer. Et puis, je mets ce personnage qui s'inspire aussi de mon bestiaire et qu'on va voir, le corps même est constitué d'une multitude de personnages, d'hybridation, de fragmentation, et il y a un peu d'humour, puisque ce personnage qui semble à la fois déséquilibré, dansé, envoie aussi un geste qu'on retrouve dans le goka, la danse, qui s'appelle le bigidi, d'où un peu the classic dance move. Donc, ça peut envoyer effectivement à la danse classique, mais aussi à ma culture. Donc, l'image suivante, s'il vous plaît. Next, please. Donc, ici, on continue toujours dans cette série de portraits d'anonymes. Donc, portraits d'anonymes, d'inconnus, de ma nouvelle famille, entre guillemets. Donc là, je l'ai présenté comme un diptyque, mais en vérité, c'est vraiment une série. L'idée, c'est toujours aussi le papier peint et l'idée de pochoir aussi, comme les tapisseries que mes grands-parents utilisaient, comment je les intègre dans mon travail, qu'est-ce que j'en fais, quelle est leur place, comment ils cohabitent, comment ils dialoguent avec les autres choses. Dans mon travail, il y a tout ce que j'aime, mais il y a aussi tout ce que j'aime pas. Des éléments comme la prise renvoient aussi à la connexion ou à la déconnexion avec soi ou avec la nature, avec l'autre. Donc, l'autre élément, l'autre pièce à côté, c'est aussi ce travail de diptyque. Mais par moment, je me permets de prendre une certaine distance. Les deux mains levées vers le ciel peuvent renvoyer au contrôle de police, de faciès, par exemple, ou les mains, don't shot, hands up, don't shot me, ce qui peut envoyer aussi à des faits d'actualité, par exemple Black Lives Matter, ou aussi plus proche de nous, Clodo. Là aussi, le fond qui est un peu plus apaisé, cependant, je me permets de le distancier par rapport au premier en mettant des trous. Ces trous peuvent envoyer à des impacts de balles. Ces trous créent une profondeur, créent un second plan qui parle d'un ailleurs, un ailleurs indéterminé, caché, qui est là, en tout cas, suggéré. L'image suivante, s'il vous plaît. Donc là, on continue. Là, je vais pas me répéter puisqu'on est toujours dans cette série de découpes. Donc là, je superpose dès le départ mes deux formats que j'interviens, dans lesquels je coupe directement ma découpe. Après, j'intervertis. Donc là, le premier, je décide de l'accompagner des personnages de mon alphabet. Donc, mon alphabet de forme, c'est un alphabet de forme que je finis par appeler ABCDA. Il part du museau du chien créole et il retrace un peu tous les animaux qu'on pourrait retrouver dans la Caraïbe, que je mets en scène comme dans les contes. L'autre image suivante, je décide de garder le fond beaucoup plus épuré, de travailler davantage de manière graphique sur mon personnage. Ce personnage bicéphale, je dis parce qu'il a deux têtes, envoie aussi d'une certaine manière à ma double culture. Aussi, puisque je suis né en Guadeloupe, mais j'ai grandi à la Dominique, donc aussi, disons, ce moi et ce moi-même. On peut passer à l'image suivante, s'il vous plaît. Donc là, pour finir, je vais finir sur mon travail de street-art qui est aussi une autre posture. Au début, j'ai beaucoup cherché à dissocier les deux, Bieber et Ronald Cyrille. Mais avec le temps, je me suis rendu compte que Bieber et Ronald Cyrille ont deux postures totalement différentes, mais néanmoins qui ne sont pas inintéressantes et qui peuvent dialoguer, puisque c'est aussi la question de la relation, du dialogue. Et lorsque j'interviens dans la rue, souvent sur des cases, ce que j'aime, c'est de faire en sorte que la bâtisse soit oubliée. Mon intervention épouse parfaitement, ou du moins du mieux que possible, les formes que je vais habiter, le lieu sur lequel je vais investir, au point où, par exemple, sur l'exemple qu'on peut voir, les fenêtres deviennent carrément les yeux du personnage. Après, on retrouve des éléments comme les chaussures, comme le personnage, comme l'oiseau, bien sûr, qui indéniablement indique que c'est du Bieber. Je vous remercie pour l'attention que vous avez portée à mon travail. That's it.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Ronald, for that wonderful presentation. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, the 2020 CCI Research Fellow, Julián Sánchez González. This presentation is going to be in English, so I would like to remind our audiences that we have language interpretation available. You can see the instructions in the slide. But basically you just click on the interpretation button on the lower left side of your screen and select English for French to English interpretation or French for English to French interpretation. So that said, I would like now to present our speaker. Julián Sánchez González is a doctoral candidate in art history at Columbia University at the City of New York, and also holds a master's in art history from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. His research focuses on the relationship between artistic and spiritual practices in modern and contemporary eras, particularly in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. His PhD dissertation explores Colombia's first World Congress of Sorcery, a 4-day international event organized in 1975 that included spiritual ceremonies, popular culture, art-making practices, and gathered scholars and artists to discuss themes related to the magical, the supernatural, the surreal, and the occult. Sánchez González's work has been supported by the Fulbright Program, the Ministerio de Cultura de Colombia, and Fundación Colfuturo. His writing has been published by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Colección Patricia Phelps de Cisneros in New York and Venezuela, Oxford Art Online, the Universidad 3 de Febrero in Buenos Aires, and the Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano in Bogotá. So without further delay, please help me welcome Julián Sánchez González.
Thank you so much, Iberia, for this kind introduction. Before I start my presentation, I would really like to express my infinite gratitude to you and to Elena for making this research fellowship happen, especially in the current conditions of the health crisis we're going through. So I feel very privileged and very honored to be able to hold this position this year, last year and this year, and to be able to show some of the results of the research that I did remotely from Bogota and also in Miami in November last year. So the title for the article that will be ultimately published as the results of my research fellowship in PAMM's website this spring is still in the works. However, I have tentatively chosen a descriptive enunciation to make clear the intentions of the intellectual pursuits that I'm in the process of considering with this project. So Vessels of Myth, the shamanistic paradigm in the works of Belkis Ayón, Arnaldo Roche-Rabell, and Purvis Young, constitutes an experimental and interdisciplinary reflection on the relationship between the literature deriving from the history of comparative religions, particularly that of shamanism, anthropology and archaeology, and the most recent academic thinking in the history of the arts of the Caribbean region and the African diaspora. Next slide, please. So I'm considering the work of 3 different artists, Arnaldo Roche-Rabell's Whose Son Am I?, Belkis Ayón Manso's Untitled, which is a depiction of the Princess Sican with white tips, and Purvis Young's Spaceman. These 3 pieces are from the early 1990s, and they belong to PAMM's collection. And in the 3 of them, the artists depicted what seemed to be alter egos in a state of transition and transformation. Previous publications on the work of these 3 artists have rightly and fully connected their overall artistic production with the spiritual and religious traditions of Judeo-Christianity in Puerto Rico for the case of Rosseravel, the secret society of Abacua in Cuba for the case of Ayón, and the presence of Santeria in Miami for the case of Young. However, these academic propositions all seem to deal uniquely with the work of these artists in relation only to themselves, a tautological input that belies any contextual analysis, or with artistic processes by other artists inspired by similar spiritual traditions. The latter falls short in providing a panoramic view of a larger cultural process of creative spiritual engagement. Moreover, in the cases in which the inherently permeable cultural backgrounds of these artists are acknowledged, theoretical tropes of hybridization and creolization tend to come to the fore as an explicative tool in the service of iconographic analysis. The useful but ultimately superficial identification of symbols, body language, uses of color and blank space then only gives us a glimpse into how we can possibly understand the work of complex and layered artists such as this ones. So in connecting the work of Roche-Rabell, Ayón Manso, and Young, I propose a comparative analysis that could help us further understand from a theoretical and interdisciplinary standpoint their connection and engagement with the spiritual world at large. For this, I am currently working through the methodologies as well as recent and not so recent proposals of the work of anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians of comparative religion, so as to integrate our cumulative knowledge on shamanism as a cultural practice within the historiography of art. A useful springboard for building this connection has been the work of Romanian historian of religion Mircea Eliade, American mythologist Joseph Campbell, Austrian-Colombian anthropologist Gerardo Rangel-Dolmatov, South African archaeologist David Lewis Williams, American medical anthropologist Michael Winkelmann, and American cultural anthropologist Mary Weismantel. So of particular interest in the search has been Winkelmann's succinct proposition of the shamanistic paradigm, which he describes as a series of historically identified behaviors in which most shamans, that is, individuals who serve as bridges with other worlds and supernatural realities, traditionally engage in, regardless of their cultural positionalities. Some of these key phenomenological experiences triggered by physical as well as spiritual conditions are posited as those of soul journey or soul flight in an altered state of consciousness, also known as ASC, and also described as a form of ecstasy, the abilities of divination, diagnosis, and prophecy, spirit relations as foundational to professional capacities, and also initiatory death and rebirth experiences. So while I would not go as far as to claim that any of these three artists I chose as case studies could be effectively deemed as shamans in their context of origins or internationally for that matter, I do find useful, despite renowned controversies on these theories, particularly those posed by pre-Columbian art historian Cecilia F. Klein, to think of their life stories and creative processes under the light of the literature of shamanism. I see this as a strategy to find some answers to lingering questions about their work, and also as a way to help us broaden our interpretative horizons on the relationship between spirituality and art in the contemporary era. So in what's left of this presentation, what I would like to do is to give you a very brief overview of the inquiries I'm currently thinking through in relation to the work of these three artists. Next slide, please. Great. So born in Santurce, Puerto Rico, educated in San Juan and Chicago, and considered one of the most influential painters in the history of Caribbean and neo-expressionist art, Rosseravel's work can be described as being in a constant pursuit for the understanding and portrayal of the paradoxical experience of the human condition. Some of the recurring themes in his impressive painterly practice, which came to a halt due to his death in 2018, include the representation of pain and agony, joy and bliss, individual and familiar relations, our perceived connection and disconnection to the natural world, and the sensorial possibilities of the corporeal and the incorporeal. In this work, I am fascinated by the ontological transgressions that this scene of simultaneous birth and sacrifice proposes, as it positions the self-portrait of the artist as a holy man in the shape of a martyr, perhaps embodying the position of Jesus being crucified. In thinking of the shamanistic paradigm earlier described, I am most interested in connecting this iconography with the idea of corporeal transcendence as a way of liberating or healing the body from its physical constraints. So one must ask, indeed, what these limitations are about, and what was this artist in search for a recreation of his own personal mythopoesis, or individual myth of origin, in combining Western and African iconographies in such a violent composition. Taking a panoramic standpoint, it should be acknowledged also that this kind of narrative is not necessarily literal or personally bound, but rather a recurrent trope in mystical healing practices elsewhere. As Colombian anthropologist Luis Eduardo Luna has beautifully commented in the past, it is in the poetic and artistic renderings of the experience of the healing process enabled by the use of sacred plants in the Amazon rainforest that one can see the interconnectedness of the whole beyond the readily available bodily experience. This process shows itself as a violent one, a crossing of a liminal boundary by force of necessity, as it requires the utmost deconstruction and reconstruction of the structures which the individual inhabits. Here, then, becomes quite successful in bringing this agitated process to a pictorial materialization by virtue of his careful selection of iconography, composition, and technique. Next slide. The work of Cuban printmaker Belkis Ayón Manso has garnered quite a lot of attention since her sister Katia and curator Cristina Vives organized a major traveling show of her artistic legacy in 2016, several years after her untimely death in 1999. Much of the literature written on her work before and after her death has largely focused on the long-standing academic and creative investment Ayón had with the Abakua, an all-male Afro-Cuban secret society with cultural and historical roots in Western Africa, particularly Nigeria. The myth of the Princess Sikan, a woman who was revealed the secret of life by the higher powers and divinities, and then sacrificed by the men of her tribe so that the secret would live amongst them, is a recurrent trope in Ayón's work, notably since the mid-1980s. The desire of spiritual transcendence was expressed in interviews by the artist during her lifetime, and is one of the reasons why she felt a personal affinity with Sikan's myth. So in this print from 1993, Sikan's iconography is clearly identifiable in the spikes around her body as they symbolize her martyrdom. In this composition, she is tormented by winged figures that take sinuous shapes resembling serpentine beings, while a larger presence looms in the back, possibly hinting at the figure of Awasi, supreme god and bearer of the secret that was given to her. This interpretation is further reinforced by the depiction of a sea creature, possibly a fish, on the upper left part of the composition, which is the worldly animal embodiment of Awasi as it encountered Sikan in the human world. What remains fascinating about the composition is that Ayón masterfully mixes part of a scene in which Sikan seems to be sinking into the underworld, a voyage of drowning underwater. According to David Lewis Williams, this type of iconography is recurrent in cave and rock art in many geographies throughout the world, and it is particularly evident in the markings left by the San peoples of Southern Africa over 70,000 years ago. This is also the way that shamanistic trance states, or ASC, have been described by psychonauts and explorers of the psyche of the contemporary era, such as the American ethnobotanist Terence McKenna. In overall terms, this process, terrifying as it is with the case of Rosseravel, also signifies the attainment of supernatural powers, a quest in which Ayón openly shared an interest in. In more concrete terms, this could be effectively interpreted as a desire to exceed the conditions of what was given to her, both as a Cuban, a woman, a Black person, and as someone with extraordinary talents traveling the world, yet feeling constantly disenfranchised by her surroundings. Here we enter in a particularly powerful and fruitful discussion on the uses of spirituality as a vessel for social, political, and cultural resistance, which is particularly interesting to consider for artists active during the swift transformations taking place in Cuba during the early 1990s. Next slide. So to finalize, I would like to make also a few remarks about this last work. Purvis Young's prolific career as an artist was and still is to a large extent understood under the rubric of self-taught art within the framework of the ever-growing studies of the arts of the African diaspora in the US. However, the most recent exhibition of his work at the Roosevelt Museum, one of the largest, if not the largest after Young's death in 2010, decidedly wished to position his paintings and drawings through the lens of their own terms, thematic explorations, preoccupations, and material interests. Active as an artist since the late 1960s in the Overtown neighborhood of Miami, Young was traditionally preoccupied with depicting the struggles of the different Black communities in his hometown, and quickly developed a body of work that became increasingly complex, tapping into larger trends of contemporary painting, whether or not formally trained. One of the most significant of these was precisely his interest in rendering the recurrent figures of his work, such as pregnant Black women, Zulu warriors, and street protesters, in compositions in outer space, surrounded by planets, stars, and alien-like creatures. In this work, titled Spaceman, Young interestingly conflates two of his recurrent figures, slaves and angels, into a single being, a Black astronaut, which is represented in a mountainous landscape, usually associated with a message of freedom as the antithesis of the urban center in Young's work. This figure is also joined in the composition by a number of horned, smaller figures that dynamize the pictorial space and potentially speak of interplanetary travel, but also of demonic and diabolical associations given to the spiritual belief systems of the African diaspora. So in thinking about this work in relation to the shamanistic paradigm of this research, I am particularly drawn to establishing a connection with the recent theorizations of Black queer time and space by academics such as Kara Keeling and Omiseke Natasha Tinsley. In both of their recent writing, it is interesting to see how their work, in clear resonance with previous writings by Cuban-American queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz, link the possibility of seeing Afro-diasporic spiritualities as a form of exceeding the conventional limits of reality and creating the world anew. One where the possibility of being is enabled under the terms of one's own conditions and necessities. This is particularly important for the work of musicians and literary figures of the Afrofuturist movement in vogue since the 1970s, an important case study for the linking of spirituality, politics, race, and artistic input. Contrary to the case of Ayón, this work then signals the possibility of soul flight, one that goes to another planet, but also one that will ultimately, and perhaps pessimistically, always be linked to the conditions of its original oppression. Here, Young makes a poignant case for the limits of utopian thinking and defies the possibilities of liberation within the conditions of material and physical inequality. This reminisces via poetic, spiritual, and artistic means the work of theorists associated with the field of cultural studies since the 1980s, famously spearheaded by figures such as Stuart Hall. So with these reflections, I think it would be good for us to start off the Q&A. I would be very curious to know your thoughts and to engage in conversation with María, Elena, Iberia, and Ronald. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ronald and Julian, for such lovely introductions to your work and practice. I wanted to start, I'm gonna go through the questions that I have here shortly. So if you have more, please go ahead and put them on the Q&A section. And as you put in your questions, I wanted to ask quickly to Ronald. You know, in Julian's presentations, we saw a lot about how these artists were using myth and mythology and just also African diasporic religions to speak about a type of resistance within the Caribbean landscape. And I was wondering if that's also something that resonates in your work. Like, do you allude to your childhood stories and so on to speak about a certain chaos or challenges within the Caribbean?
Oui. I will answer. I can answer in English, but I can also answer in French. I don't really know.
Whatever works for you.
Yes, I mean, because I grew in Dominica in a kind of way. We have a lot of story that's the same in Guadeloupe. When we also talk like stories about the Sukuyan in Dominica, like a singer like Jeff Joseph did a song on it, about it. Yeah, and in Guadeloupe, we also have what we call les contes. Les contes, in French, sont des histoires qu'on raconte, et puis moi, ça m'inspire beaucoup. So it's about how my personal mythology at time will be meeting with my myth legend and count of the countries from the area from the Caribbean, also not only Dominica, but Guadeloupe and Martinique. Like sometimes the piece when I talk about the sacred feminine, and I was saying about, comment ça s'appelle encore? Is also, c'est une figure de la mythologie. And I forgetting her name, but c'est une figure de la mythologie et on la retrouve dans la Caraïbe. Donc moi, le lien que je fais aussi, when you tell me about resistance, for example, in my representation, the way I choose to represent things is already a kind of resistance. Why? Because I mean, I have a classic formation, puisque j'ai fait une école d'art et en 2012, j'ai eu mon master en art. Et puis là aussi, la question de la représentation des canons, de la représentation, mais des canons de beauté aussi m'ont questionné, la question de la référence. Et donc, une fois que j'ai décidé de commencer à créer, d'où aussi la question de mon bestiaire. Donc, il faut dire que mon travail, c'est un travail qui est très spontané. Donc, c'est un travail qui se nourrit beaucoup de l'imaginaire. Et kind of way answer to your question, je m'inspire beaucoup de mes souvenirs d'enfance. That means it's have a kind of dialogue between the past and the present, between my
Your memories, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, your memories. So it's not only the content, but also the aesthetic choice that you make by the way you depict your
Yes, because
work. Yes.
like when I talk, lorsque je parle du chien créole, because I want to talk about vagabondage and things like that, je décide de choisir le visage du chien pour parler de l'errance et du vagabondage pictural, mais aussi physique. Donc c'est aussi, finalement, ce chien, je ne le garde pas comme il est. Je prends une certaine distance. Je suis en train de le déstructurer. Donc il s'agit pour moi aussi, quelque part, de comment dirais-je, décomposer, prendre du recul avant de pas représenter, mais présenter les choses sous un autre angle. Donc, je définis les choses comme je suis. Ce qu'il me semble, c'est l'essence. Lorsque je regarde ce chien créole et j'ai envie de parler de vagabondage et d'errance, je décide de garder seulement son museau que je vais par la suite spéculer et qui va devenir poisson, qui va devenir oiseau et qui va vraiment former tout mon univers. Et donc, là aussi, c'est vraiment comme si je créais un monde à part. Donc, il y a ces animaux réels, mais il y a mes animaux imaginaires aussi. Et donc, quelque part, on retourne aussi dans la philosophie ou dans des pensées, par exemple, le monde des doigts glissants, la question du rhizome, aussi des racines multiples. Moi qui suis né en Guadeloupe et qui ai grandi à la Dominique, puis qui suis retourné. Et même mes animaux. Par exemple, mes grands-parents agriculteurs, pêcheurs, il arrive que je prenne des morceaux disparates pour former un nouveau tout. Donc, à la fois, mes personnages même, ce que j'ai appelé mon vocabulaire plastique, mon alphabet, lui-même vient à un moment à s'hybrider entre lui, à se mélanger. Donc, il y a sans cesse une nouvelle création. Et c'est une création qui s'inspire du vécu, du vu, mais c'est une création qui prend naissance à partir de mes rêves, de mes désirs et de ma posture. C'est-à-dire que, par exemple, je suis spirituel, mais pas religieux. Donc, j'ai un cheminement par rapport à ça même dans ma création, comment je décide aussi de déambuler sans savoir où je vais. Et donc, c'est comment les choses que j'utilise à force vont devenir signes, vont devenir paroles, vont devenir gestes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how in both your presentations, of the three artists that Julian discusses, and also like in your work, Ronald, we can see this blend of disparate traditions and beliefs, you know, how myth conflicts with reality. And there are also like certain ideas or elements that resonate or that recur. And one of those that I noticed from your presentations is the mask, or this idea of masquerading. So I was wondering if you could, like both of you could address that question, like how does the masquerade function, Ronald, in your work, and then Julian, that appears, I remember in the work of Rosseravel, and maybe we could also think of that idea of the masquerade in relation to Belkis Ayón's work. So maybe we can start with Ronald. Do you want to start?
Okay, why not? Well, I mean, the mask, kind of with the mask, we all have a mask. Our skin is, first of all, is a kind of mask for me. And it's true that the mask, c'est toujours la question de l'apparence. C'est toujours la question du paraître, du faux semblant, du caché, du révélé. Donc pour moi, porter le masque, c'est aussi quelque part être dans un questionnement de ce qu'on donne à voir. Mais aussi, ce masque, il se rattache aussi à ma culture. C'est-à-dire qu'ici, dans la Caraïbe, à la fois, on est français, on est caraïbéen. Moi, je suis dominicain en Guadeloupe. En Guadeloupe, je suis... enfin, en Dominique, je suis Frenchman. Donc, c'est comment aussi nos cultures, j'ai envie de dire, nos identités sont multiples dans la Caraïbe. Et donc, par exemple, la question du masque, on le retrouve dans certaines tribus. Donc, ça fait partie de notre héritage. Par exemple, Aimé Césaire, lorsqu'il parle de la mémoire au-delà de la mémoire, sont des éléments aussi qui m'intéressent. Nous, on a des événements en ce moment, normalement, avec le Covid, malheureusement, ça ne peut pas se faire. Mais on a ce qu'on appelle le carnaval. Le carnaval, c'est aussi un moment propice où les gens décident de par moment, mettre un peu en retrait la vie de qui ils sont tous les jours. Et ils décident que pendant un moment déterminé, pendant un jour, pendant une soirée, ils vont être quelqu'un d'autre. Donc, c'est aussi ça, la capacité de choisir. Mais aussi, pour moi, ce masque renvoie aussi quelque part à cette société. C'est-à-dire, pour moi, c'est une forme de protection. C'est aussi un peu le trou de la serrure. Aussi bien pour celui qui regarde, parce que celui qui regarde, qui est masqué, il voit tout de l'autre. C'est l'autre qui ne voit pas tout de lui. Donc, pour moi, ça devient un jeu entre l'observé et celui qui observe. Au-delà de ça, je veux dire que par rapport au masque, justement, là, on a noté dans une pièce, mais bon, c'est quand même, je le vois, mariage, c'est une série de plus de 50 pièces, voire une soixantaine de pièces. Donc, c'est vrai que, comme je disais, il y a des éléments qui font signe, qui reviennent, qui se transforment. Et ce masque-là, en même temps, il fait un peu clin d'œil au Covid. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'est pas le masque de Covid, mais quelque part, c'est comment questionner les choses d'une autre manière. Chez moi, les choses sont finalement, comme dans ma culture, toujours d'une manière un peu indéterminée. Lorsqu'on parle tout à l'heure là de Soukouyan ou de Dorlis, ou lorsqu'on parle de Maman de l'eau que je ne trouvais pas, en fait, les choses sont souvent dans un entre-deux. Et pour moi, c'est important parce que ça me laisse la place pour que je puisse spéculer et donner ma propre version. Donc, c'est ça un peu. Le masque, c'est toujours celui où je vois, mais je ne sais pas totalement. Donc, ce que je ne vois pas, je peux deviner.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Iberia. And I think what Ronald is saying about persistence and about trying to or effectively becoming something else by wearing a mask is a very powerful statement. And it's definitely something that I strongly resonate with when I think about the work of these three artists. Is the fact that in the way that they're representing their alter egos, they're also proposing a new reality. So this kind of creation of a different identity, I think, is highly linked to the practices of masquerade in the Caribbean, for sure. And in that sense, it is also linked to the different spiritual practices, whether hybrid or whether coming from one specific place, and how they incorporate that into their own creative process. I think this idea of the carnivalesque as something that inherently subverts the structures and the traditions of, logocentrism and a very structured way, maybe like a grid-like structure of understanding reality, is embedded into this idea of the masquerading practices. And so, for instance, in the work of Rosseravel, we see this like birthing scene in which what could be considered this female figure in the composition is wearing an African mask, and the artist himself is represented as a figure of Jesus or a saint that is being crucified. And so, that speaks volumes to me about that intersection of cultures on one end, but also on the other end of this idea of indeterminacy, because it's really hard to really capture the real meaning of a work like this. It's very convoluted, but it's also multifarious. And so the inclusion of those different cultural elements in a composition like that, I think adds to the mystery, but also the power in terms of how they can politically and culturally resist to impose ways of understanding not only their art making practices, but also, other cultural cues that were definitely embedded in the way that they were raised in their countries of origin. So yeah, I mean, it's a very long discussion, and I'm thinking a lot about Blair Toncon's and Lisa Thompson work on masquerade and carnivalesque practices in the Caribbean en masse. And there's so much there that can be unpacked. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I also think that that in Roche's work, so the juxtaposition between like his self-portrait with the mask and blue eyes versus like then the mother with the African mask, like mother was a mulata. So he's also speaking about these tensions or like conflicts of identity in relation to race, but also in relation to his heritage. Like his Afro-Caribbean heritage, but also then he's more like European or Spanish heritage. So thank you both for that.
I wanted to start by taking some questions from the audience. Here it says, the first one by an anonymous attendee, I have two Purvis Young paintings with what I regard as angels watching over Overtown. A large figure with a halo surrounded by buildings, cars, and dancing figures. The spaceman's helmet looks like a halo. Did Purvis Young practice Santeria? Is the spaceman a sort of human angel?
I love that question, and I really appreciate the fact that they capture those details, because those are actually one of the most important details that I was thinking through when seeing his work. So one of the really big tropes of Purvis Young's oeuvre is the angel. As I said in my presentation, both the angel and the slave are conflated into this one figure, as the astronaut has shackles around his hands and also his feet. And so what I think is really interesting is the fact that by propelling this figure into outer space, he's also thinking about ways of thinking the world anew, of creating different realities, but also I think it's a way of healing and of creating hope, which is the reason why he constantly depicts angels over town and over Miami in his work. As some of you may know, Purvis's work was highly interested in depicting the struggles of the different Black communities that inhabited the neighborhood that he was originally born in. And not only he depicted street protests and also needles representing the use of drugs and Black women pregnant as a way of signaling hope, but also the angels represented this idea that a better future was to be construed or was to be built, and that was possible. And so in this kind of like really strange Afrofuturistic, or not as strange, but rather unusual for his work, Afrofuturistic gesture of combining the astronaut with the angel, I think is making a really, really powerful work message that I'm really interested in flashing out more in the article that I will be publishing later in the spring. So yeah, thank you. That's wonderful.
Now we have another question by Jeff Donnelly, where they ask, to what extent are these works influenced by colonial religions, Protestantism and Catholicism?
The works of Belkis and Arnaldo Roche are definitely influenced by Catholicism. Both of them constantly depict images of crosses and crucifixions, and but it's a hybridized language, so that's definitely there for sure. And we know this is a fact for different Afro-Cuban religions, and even though Arnaldo was to my knowledge never associated with an Afro-Puerto Rican religion, he was part of that cultural context growing up. And there are certain texts that position his work in relation to Santeria as well. And so I'm curious to know more about that side of the story for his own personal experience. But the work of and the imagery of Catholicism is definitely present in his work. For the case of Purvis, he was very mysterious about his own personal affiliations with spirituality, although he had a really close friend that was a santero, a famous santero from Miami in the 1980s, 1990s. And he was really critical of the church, although we're not entirely sure whether he was a practicing Protestant or Catholic. But that's kind of like indeterminate. But I think that in his own personal spiritual world, there was definitely a mix of different things that belonged to his own upbringing, as well as to people that influenced his life story as he grew up and created his work in Overtown.
Now, thank you.
Can I just comment one thing? Because I think the fact of that you brought up, Julian, about Roche in relation to Santeria is very interesting, and one like worth probably looking into further, because I do remember like some scholars that have discussed that, and I think Edward Sullivan has, for example, addressed that, and saying that, for instance, like Roche's faces, figures, some of his figures and faces we call like Orisha deities, and also like with the use of, for instance, like color, like yellow, that is a very important color within Orisha rituals. It's also very present in Roche's work. And obviously the importance of syncretism that you would find, you know, in Santeria, and that is present in Roche's work, the interaction between like nature, spirit, man. I mean, there are many different aspects of Santeria that you can see. Maybe it's not an explicit reference, but there are like resonances or different, let's say, like connections that could be potentially explored.
Thank you. I also have another question for Ronald. It says, Ronald, as a graffiti artist, you have to create when law enforcement and the general public doesn't disturb you. I would imagine that you work mainly at night. What role does nighttime play in your overall work, including your paintings? And this is by Alex Pierre.
Oh, Alex. All right. Well, I'll say that at the beginning, I'd start at night time, but it's true that fast enough, people start to know who was Bieber, because in a kind of way, we're not living in a big country. We're living on a small island, and everybody know everybody's on the island. So that's how things come true. So I mean, a certain time, I wasn't like waiting on night time to go and paint. I was like feeling like, act like this is like I going to do a crime. So a certain time I just decide, okay, well, I'll feel free and I go in and work all day, like morning time, afternoon, don't matter. And this was important enough for me, because I believe is at this time I start to meet people and start to really hear what they was thinking about my work and what they was appreciating my work. And that's how I decide to make a kind of statement and say that, okay, right. Well, right now, B-Bird will do what he want when he want, and don't matter if the police come, well, I'll just have to talk with the guys and explain them, well, this is what I do, and I share in my universe in this type of way. And yeah, I mean, in the week, I was doing some street art and some pass, and right now we can be talking and we just have respect because they themselves, they also dreaming. I mean, yeah, that's a part of the real story. Police, government, everybody dreaming. And me, my job is to share my dream.
Now, I will ask one last question because we're at the end. And I'll ask, it's by John Pierre. And he asks, or they ask, we speak of realization in language, but do you see it in art? And if so, how? And I think that we can probably all speak to this question, which is why I think it's a good question to end the program with.
Yeah, that's a nice one.
Anybody wants to take it? I mean.
Yeah, well, I can start. In a kind of way, creolization, I'll take it in French. I'll feel more comfortable. Creolization, on va le rattacher, c'est le concept des doigts glissants. Et pour moi, c'est aussi quelque part, c'est la relation. Donc moi, je me sens, comment dirais-je, dans une forme de créolisation dans ce que je donne à voir dans mon travail. C'est vrai que sur un plan littéraire, ou même de ce que j'ai vu des œuvres de la collection d'Édouard Glissant, il semblerait que ça tendait beaucoup plus vers une abstraction. Cependant, pour moi, dans la créolisation aussi, je vois l'idée de la mise en relation d'objets disparates, de différents fragments. Donc, en fait, pour moi, je m'y retrouve un peu lorsque je suis en train de créer mes êtres hybrides. Donc, mes êtres qui sont de pure création à partir d'existants, de fragments d'existants, pour lesquels je trouve un nouveau lieu où ils cohabitent, où finalement, il y a une forme de, comment dirais-je, d'équilibre. Et donc, c'est un peu ça pour moi, entre guillemets, ma manière que la créolisation pourrait se manifester dans mon travail, sans pour autant chercher à rentrer directement dans cette problématique-là, mais comment moi, en tant que dans mes recherches plastiques, comment je pense
Yeah, I think there's this one really beautiful aspect about the notion of creolization or creolization as Glissant understands it, is that creolization doesn't mean synthesis, but rather the integration of different cultural elements in a way that each cultural element also remains integral and does not fade into that process of blending. But at the same time, in that creolization process, there is an aspect of mystery that remains, as much as we don't really know for sure or entirely how the identity process functions. And so there's an aspect of mystery there that is really fascinating, in the way that Glissant theorized about, the postmodern subject, the postmodern identities of the late 1980s, early 1990s. And when I take a look at the work of artists who engage with different spiritual systems, I feel that is precisely what happens when the different blends of spiritual denominations come into play. And we were talking about this earlier, María Elena and Iberia. During my trip to Miami, I had the opportunity to see the work of contemporary artists like Nicole Salcedo and Vicky Pierre, who are fascinating in what they do, and they take clear, direct cues from the work of artists like Belkis Ayón and Purvis Young and so forth. And I see this element of trying to understand the mystery of identity and enjoying the sublimity of what that means, but at the same time not fully trying to understand what it is. So it's like this tension between knowing but not knowing too much. And I think that keeps on happening in the creative processes of artists who were influenced by these artists that I'm researching from the early 1990s. So there's this whole theoretical thread that can be drawn, which I think is really fascinating to explore. And creolization is definitely like a springboard for that kind of analysis.
Well, if there are any more, I want to say thank you to everybody here, not only our fantastic panelists, but also evening with us. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have the 2021 CCI Research Fellowship open call. The deadline is April 8th, and we're offering opportunities to curators, artists, researchers, scholars, cultural practitioners based in Florida, the Caribbean, and also diaspora. And if you have any questions, please visit our website, cci.pamm.org. And also, if you want to hear more about our wonderful panelists, you can follow Ronald on Instagram. Look him up as Blackbird. And Julian, you can reach him also through us or through any other means, and also his writing. And we look forward to sharing.
Sorry. Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you both again on behalf of the CCI and everyone. Thank you again to our AV team. And thank you to our audience for coming tonight and being with us tonight. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Celestin, thank you all for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And let's stay connected. See you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you.